Yes.
Did your children go on the walk in the school bus when they were little? Or are they big enough that they're not going on it?
Can you say it again?
Did your children go on the walk in the school bus?
No, in the mornings the two younger ones walk them.
Yeah.
Walk them upstairs.
Yeah, but then after like
On the way back from school they also walk.
oh, so
So it's mine. What age did yours start walking?
Just this year.
How old?
And she's 10,
Son.
almost 11.
What makes she 11?
July 4th.
Oh, my Jessie's 29th of July.
Wow.
We were both preggers at the same time.
Well, my youngest one, July 28th.
Ah!
Wait,
Oh, wow. Can I ask you a question? This is me desperately trying to claw back some marks. I know that this, I put negative gear in here, but actually, I don't think it's entirely wrong. Looking at your slides from this week, but you haven't taught us all that stuff.
well, negative gearing, you know what negative gearing is. You don't have enough income to cover
Yeah.
your debt service.
So that's, because that's, the charts are invisible, the charts, whereas people do negative gearing now.
Knowing, yes.
Is it more? It's not so. Desperately, it's all right. It's an unadulterated desperately, that's okay. I have to try.
Or did you see them on the walking bus, Bianca, or why did you ask me that?
I was thinking because I run a school bus. We give out a school bus that's like very successfully renowned. And some of the get to very swim at lunchtime. And so we get treats and snacks. And I was just thinking, if you're going to go somewhere else, it's silly that
afternoon. So it's my turn to talk now, guys. So I hope you all received my email with the assumptions for the assignment. If you have not received an email, then let me know so I can send that to you again. But it was sent to your Auckland Uni email. In case you don't check it, it is there. So you're now all set to work on your assignment. You have a tutorial video that's going to guide you through completing the DCF part of the assignment. In the video, I go through building monthly cash flows. Some of you have been assigned quarterly or semi-annual cash flows, but you just have to adjust your calculations to reflect the frequency. But that is not a big task to change that. Next Thursday, well, I was originally planning to do it this Thursday to do an assignment workshop, but I think I'll give you more time to work on the model. And then next week, we can meet and I will be available to answer any questions you have about your assignment. And if you are so overachiever and have completed your Excel assignment completely, I can have a look at it and tell you, yes, you are all good to go to do your executive summary, or no, you have to fix maybe something in your assignment. But so there is a lot of hand-holding in this assignment. I want you to do well on this assignment. A lot of you might have never used Excel, but this is something that employers will really get a lot of feedback that this is something they really want you to have the skill of using Excel as to use all the functionalities and the power that Excel has. And this is just the beginning, what you're doing in this assignment. It's really just scratching the surface. So I'm here to help you, and typically students do really well on this assignment. It's an average grade of maybe 80% students get. So students failing that's hard to fail this assignment. Yes. Any questions? No, good. Financial leverage. I'm sure you watched this lecture and you just had a big sigh of relief that it was easy, yes? No big pro formas, just one tiny formula. Very good. But nevertheless, financial leverage is important, and in real estate, we just can't avoid it. So let's just talk about leverage. Leverage. Well, first of all, think of a lever in general in space. Lever is something that helps you. You know, for example, you have a can of paint that hasn't been opened. You know, try to open it with your nails. Impossible. You take a screwdriver, that's a lever, and you can open that can easily. Or take a spade. You know, we're digging holes in the ground. Even that handle on the spade, you know, try to hold the handle right next to the actual spade. It's difficult to dig anything, but once you hold it up at the top, it gives you a lot more leverage to dig a bigger hole much easier. So what we see from leverage is that it gives you ability, like gives you magic powers to do something that you can't do on your own. So it's there to help you. The same way in finance, leverage is really helps you to do something that you just can't do with what you have at your disposal. So it allows you to own with very little of your own money. It allows you to own an asset that exceeds the value of your equity multiple times. So if you can just save up, say, $100,000, and you can easily buy an asset that's worth $1 million. So financial leverage definitely opens up doors for investors. And because real estate requires significant outlays of money at the very beginning, really in most circumstances, financial leverage, we just can't avoid it. It's a necessity in property investment. Therefore, it's important to understand the consequences of using financial leverage in property investment. But just like any superhero can turn into a supervillain, the same can be said about financial leverage. Most of the time, we know of the great benefits of using financial leverage. But there are circumstances when financial leverage works against you. And it's very easy to, just as it, on one side, it can magnify your gains, financial leverage. On the other side, it can also magnify your losses. And you can lose everything by using financial leverage. It will erase all of your equity that you've built up. So that's why it's really, you have to look at financial leverage as a double-edged sword. And in your lecture, you would have seen this graph. And that's looking at financial returns for different property portfolios, depending on how leveraged they are. So you can see that the greater the amount of leverage you're using, typically it works in your favor. You can significantly increase your returns just by utilizing more debt in property investment. And when you're using leverage, there are certain advantages, and that is one big advantage of leverage is diversification. And that is, instead of just putting all of your equity into just saving up enough to buy an asset where you put in all of your equity in it, use no debt, zero leverage, you are really then have to put a lot of faith in that project performing well and bringing you returns that you want. But with using leverage, you can use the same amount of equity, complement that with debt, and buy multiple properties. And then if you invest wisely into assets that are not correlated, so if one asset is performing well, you can write that out, and maybe another one is not performing so well. But in the end, it will all average out. So you can, by diversifying, you're not always just heading into one direction. There are other advantages of leverage that investors can benefit, but probably diversification is one of the main ones. And also, using somebody else's money is typically cheaper, the cost of it, than using your own money. And that's why you see when an equity investor, their required rates of return several times greater than interest rate that you pay to the bank. In the bank, you can get a loan at 4%, for example. But if you want to go to get, if you're putting in your own money into the project, you will require a lot more return than just 4%, because you have a lot more at stake. Banks can ask for much lower interest rates because they have less risk, and because they are first in line to receive anything from your project if it goes bust. And they have even ability to go after you, even if you couldn't repay everything from the sale of that property. So you're still in debt to them. But you as an individual investor really have no rights to it until the bank gets paid. That's why they can ask for lower interest rates, because they don't have that risk component. So you can see that there are times when definitely leverage plays to your benefit, and the more you leverage, the higher your return is going to be. But it's not always the case, and we have seen during the financial crisis where actually those who were most leveraged lost the most money as well. Whereas those who had very little leverage, their losses were much less severe. So it can go both ways. So let's look at an example. Let's say you've been working very hard and you've saved up $200,000. You have $200,000 in cash accessible to you. It's your money, your sweat in it. So you have options how to spend this $200,000. You can take this $200,000 and invest the whole thing into buying a house. The caveat there is you have to go to West Coast to buy it. That's the most affordable place in New Zealand, still where you can buy a house for $200,000. So you go to the West Coast, spend your $200,000, have no debt whatsoever. The house is yours from the moment you bought it. You can go stay in Auckland, go say in Auckland City, in Avondale, you can still buy a house for $1 million. So you will leverage your investment. So it's still your $200,000, but this time you're buying a $1 million property with your $200,000. So you're using financial leverage. Now, a West Coast property investor has a $200,000 portfolio. You investing in Avondale property have now a $1 million property portfolio. Still using the same $200,000. But another investor might be even wiser. They decided to spread their $200,000 across 4 properties. They convinced the lender that they're only going to put $50,000 on $1 million properties, and you've been listening to the benefits of diversification and real estate, so you decided to invest, although you're sticking with the same asset type, residential, but you decided to go to North Shore, to Manukau, to Auckland City, and to Orewa. So you've diversified geographically, and you acquired yourself, actually I shouldn't have said debt of $4 million. It's your portfolio is $4 million, your debt is $3.8 million. But still, your own equity is $200,000. So let's see how leverage is then going to affect you. All right, so you have, it's very zoomed in, your $200,000, your bag of money, and let's look, you have one scenario where you've invested $200,000 and 0% debt. Another one, you still own one house, but with $200 of equity and $800 of debt. And then you have a scenario of 4 houses, $200 equity and 3.8 in debt. Let's say property market. Let's ignore what's happening right now. We'll say 5% property price are appreciating everywhere across New Zealand, 5%. So it's good, which means your West Coast house in 1 year from now will be worth, with 5% appreciation, it will be $210,000. So as an investor, you put in $200,000, you extracted $210,000 at the end of the year. What's your return? 10%. 5%. 5% is your return. So whatever was their capital appreciation of the house, the same was the appreciation of your equity, 5%. Let's say in Auckland, our house is now worth 5% more, which means it's $1,050,000. We go to our lender. Let's say we had an interest-only loan. and we repay 800 back to the lender, which leaves us with 250,000. So we've put in 200, we've extracted 250. So extra 50,000 gives us a return on this investment, 25%. Still same 200,000. Now we're going to our portfolio of 4 houses. They all appreciated at 5%. So which means at the end of the year, your property portfolio is now worth 4.2 million. You go to the lender, repay the debt of 3.8, and you are now, you extracted 400,000 from this. So you started off with 200, and at the end of the year, you doubled your investment, and you now have 400,000 in your pocket. So it's the same 200,000 working for you. It just depends what choices you've made in terms of leveraging your investment. And in this case, your return is 100%. Well, if the market is not doing well, and it's actually, there was a 5% loss in the values in 1 year, which means when you go and sell your house, after 1 year, the West Coast property is going to sell for 190,000. Since you have no obligations to a lender to repay any debt, this 190,000 is all yours. So you've invested 200, you took out 190 at the end, you only lost 10,000. So your loss is 5%, exactly what was the loss in the value of the property. If you have your Avondale house, which was 1 million a year ago, today it's 950,000. You leveraged your investment with an $800,000 loan, so you have left, after paying off your lender, you have 150,000. So you now lost 50,000. And that is a 25% loss. For your $4 million property portfolio, your house is collectively now worth $3.8 million. Guess what? This is exactly what you owe to your lender, which means in the end, you're going to be left with an absolute zero. So you lost completely everything, and you have to start off from scratch. So you can see here that when property prices are going in the direction you want them to go, you want properties to appreciate in value, certainly leverage is great. But on the flip side, if prices are not going up, and even worse, they're going down, clearly you can lose everything. Whereas those who had no leverage, they are the smallest losers. Those who invest and highly leveraged, they're the biggest losers. So basically the message is that leverage can work both ways, and you have to really appreciate the effect of using debt on your investment. When we talk about leverage, the moment you decide to use any amount of debt in your investment, immediately you're attracting more risk. And we have seen that from the previous example. So leverage equals risk. And in property investment, what we need to understand is the differences between actual rates of return. So actual return is you come to the end of your project, you have sold it, you know everything about what happened in the past. So actual rate of return is going to be based on the actual historical data of the performance of your property, so you can calculate it with exact precision of what your actual rate of return was. Whereas your required rate of return is all based on your expectations about how that property is going to perform, and those expectations are going to be based on your not attitude, but perceptions, on your perceptions of risk when you go into that investment. So risk is the chance that you might never get your rate of return that you set out to achieve. So it's the difference between what was actually achieved on this type of investment historically versus what are the expectations of how this property investment type is going to perform in the future. And we do have a lot of historical data and can look at how assets perform over time. And there is one very longitudinal data set that looked at the returns on different asset classes. And you can see that stocks, if you would have invested in stocks, if you start off with $10 investment in 1872 and in 2015 you want to take that investment back, we clearly can see that stocks would have returned the most over that time span. But at the same time, the option that gives you the highest return also comes with the highest risk, and that is they have the highest magnitude of the losses. Yeah? Potentially you can lose up to 43% in any given year. But one message from risky assets, such as stocks or property, is that you cannot go into it short term. You have to be invested in it long term in order to get the sort of average returns that are promised by this type of investment. In property, you have to probably wait at least 5-10 years, to really get the whole benefit of property investment. If you're after a quick return, property is not your kind. We have a study that was done a few years ago, but they looked at returns of equity firm that invests in real estate. And they've separated the returns based on how leveraged those investments were. So you can see that some of the returns are quite clustered, and some returns are very dispersed. But also you can see that the ones that are very clustered, their range of returns is quite narrow, the band. Those that are not clustered, the range varies a lot. And so you have a high chance that you will get a very high rates of return. At times, there will be chance where you get very low rate of return. And those returns, you can also see that they're increasing with the leverage percentage. So the more leverage, the more risky, the higher rates of return you can potentially get. But there is a lot of risk. So how do you measure this risk? And in property investment, the risk is often measured with the standard deviation. So standard deviation is a way of expressing these variations from the zero. It's a way of kind of averaging your returns. And you can see that, the higher the standard deviation, that means the more return there is going to be. The higher the chance that your return, actual return, is going to be lower than what you expected, but also a chance that it can be a lot higher than what you expected. So leverage attracts risk, but also opportunities. So let's run through Kahoot now. I guess we're not going to have a lot of players today. Quite slow. Well, we'll just start. Very interesting. So leverage ratio is measured by the ratio between the value of the asset and the equity that you're putting into that asset. So this particular investment has a leverage ratio of 20, which means that every dollar of equity invested in this $1 million house is represented by $20 in debt or in leverage. Yes, so 95% is the loan to value ratio. 5% is the percentage of equity in this investment. 19 is the ratio between debt and equity. And 20 is the answer that you're looking for. That's the leverage ratio, value of asset to equity. So that is the mode answer is the correct one, obviously, yes. You all seem to appreciate that positive leverage. What is positive leverage? First of all, that's when the use of leverage can significantly enhance your return. And that was our example with either putting 100% equity into West Coast house to spreading your wealth across 4 properties. Yes, you can, that's the 4 properties example was the example of positive leverage when prices are going up. So your use of leverage significantly enhances your returns. And in this case, it happens when the cost of debt is less than return on the asset. That is the return that you can get when you use no leverage at all. Also in this lecture, you would have come across a formula for estimating what your return on equity is going to be. And that formula was, so to estimate before tax return on equity is you take what would your return be if you put no leverage into it. So it's 100% cash investment, only equity. So that's the total return on property plus the difference between this before tax IRR on property and the cost of debt divided by the debt to equity ratio. So you can see here is where you need to have the conditions for positive leverage. You see if this component is negative, and the only reason it's going to be negative do you guys want to contribute to positive leverage? Is that what you're discussing there? So you can see here, that's where we can find out whether there is conditions for positive leverage. Only if return on property, that's the case when you're using no debt, exceeds what the rate of interest you pay on the loan, as long as it's greater, this return, this always is going to be positive.
And your slides have there was rather than a divide.
I mean, it's times, sorry, it's not divide. Yes, of course it is times. Times debt to equity ratio. Thanks, Bianca, for correcting me here. Yes, it is times. Probably students were discussing that part of the, yes. So that is where you can see the first indication you're going to have positive leverage. And of course, this component here is only going to magnify that even further. If this is positive, and the more debt you use, of course, that ratio is going to be bigger as well. So these two are going to enhance your return on equity. But if this is smaller than cost of debt, this is going to be negative. So all you're going to do is magnify your losses. Almost a split decision here, but the smaller the ratio, the smaller the leverage ratio, that means you're using more equity. So in this case, yes, building B has a ratio, which has a leverage ratio of 5, uses more equity. So let's say, for example, you are buying a $100,000 house, and if you put in $20,000 in equity, that gives you a leverage ratio of 5. Or if you put in $10,000 of equity, that gives you a leverage ratio of 10. So that's the smaller the leverage ratio, the more equity you're using. So another way to interpret a leverage of 10 means for every dollar you're using $10 of debt. Here for 5, for every dollar of your equity, you're using $5 of debt. Well, you guys have identified correctly that it will not increase property owners' taxable income. And this is another tick towards using financial leverage, is because the interest that you pay on debt, on your investment property, not for your own house, but if you're an investor and you don't reside in that property, you can claim all of that interest against your taxable income. So actually, you're going to decrease your taxable income by the amount of interest that you're paying. And that's why a lot of investors actually go for interest-only loans. And a bit of statistics, 50% of investors use interest-only loans, which is quite high in New Zealand. Very risky, but seems banks go along with that too, so it's not just investors. Well, yes, if we already have seen this formula, and of course, the cheaper cost you pay on debt, the more you can increase your IRR on the equity that you invest in the project. So yes, property A will have a greater IRR. Yes, so when we're looking at internal rate of return, we can't just take that blindly, ignoring everything else that's going around that contributed to getting this 19% IRR. And as I said, once you start getting leverage, immediately you're attracting risk to your project. And the more leverage you use, the more risk you have. So really, in order to compare 16 and 19%, this 19% has to be risk adjusted. And as an investor, you have to decide, is 3% enough compensation for you for the additional risk that you're undertaking with high leverage? And different investors will have different perceptions. So there isn't just one answer that 3% is more than enough. For somebody, that's not even close to where they would start considering 3% to be an adequate risk-adjusted percentage. So that would be it for our today's Kahoot and lecture. So we'll see you next week.
Okay, see you later. Thanks.
Yep, see you.